You're watching News at Prime. Well, let's bring you this now. Interviews of shortlisted candidates to fill positions on the National Youth Development Agency Board have caused a stir among South Africans. Competency questions have been raised after some applicants struggled to answer questions from parliamentarians. Let's discuss this now, and we're joined by political analyst Lukhona Mnguni, who himself was previously one of the people considered for the NYDA board. I thought it important to mention that, Mr. Mnguni, but before we get into the interview, let's just give viewers just a quick sense of some of the performance of these candidates. So here's one.
In as far as NYDA must fulfill its objectives, right?
Yes.
Youth development, the things that you would have mentioned here.
Yes.
Now, there's the NYDA Act, and then there's the legal framework of the NYDA Act. I want to know if you understand the relationship between those two, and if you can give me some practical example, even one, that demonstrates to us and the people of South Africa that you'll be serving, that you understand this relationship.
Okay. Okay, so from the as NYDA is mandated to obviously do the youth development, for me to answer this question, I am going to use that example of the rural being integrated into the okay, so the framework essentially is the skeleton, and then from the act itself, it's the policy, the legal framework will be.
Mr. Mnguni, let's bring you into the conversation. The answer was simply not given by the candidate here. Let me ask you this question. What qualities does the NYDA look for in board members, and where are these people drawn from, seeing that you have gone through this process before?
Well, Polly, a very good evening to you and your viewers. We were actually discussing this question as friends, and one of my colleagues said that, you know, the question itself was a bit dizzy because, to be quite fair and frank, I'm not sure how you separate the legal framework from an act, because the legal framework or architecture of any institution flows from the legal and legislated instruments that are available from it. So I'm not sure whether the question was fair in its own sense, but anyway, to answer your question, when you talk about the qualities and where people are drawn from, you would know that Parliament gives out a public advert. And in this round of applications for the NYDA board, there were over 1,000 people who applied. The question that I think probably ought to be posed is how transparent and how open are the sifting and shortlisting mechanisms. So when you've got over 1,000 people, what are the instruments that are used to grade and judge the competencies of various people, and whether or not people in some instances do embellish their CVs or not? And that's another question for a different day. So, Polly, I mean, I'm trying to say it's open to all young people who qualify between the ages of 18 and 35 as per the Act. And it's the sifting mechanism that we probably need to pay closer attention to. Of course, there's always a bit of jostling between different, interest groups, and particularly political parties who want to make sure that those who may well be aligned to them have a fair chance. So, I mean, here we have probably, a very small cohort of people shortlisted from a very large pool of applicants. And the question is whether or not, if a different person was to sift through that bigger pool, they would come to a conclusion of these shortlisted candidates. And I think that mechanism is probably something to look into the future. But I think, lastly, Polly, the qualities that, of course, anybody should look for in terms of the NYDA board is competence, is knowledge, is passion for young people, and is demonstrable leadership in some degree of life, whether whether in terms of student activism, whether in other spaces of life and ecosystems of our society.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question around some of what people complain that is perhaps the lack of visibility of the projects that are embarked upon by NYDA, and include in there the impact of what this organization has or should be doing, particularly when it comes to young people. But before we get there, I just want for viewers to really get a feel of what happened in Parliament. So let's take a listen to just this second candidate who was also questioned or at least interviewed. Let's put it that way. Let's take a listen.
Now, it would have made sense to me if you had completed your diploma in 2011, but you have since clarified it to us that you in fact completed it in 2021. So it means you would have been a senior researcher for 5 years without a post-matric qualification. My question to you is, if we were to appoint you, recommend you, and the president were to appoint you to lead the NYDA, would you appoint or employ someone without a post-matric qualification to be a senior researcher in any process or department within the National Youth Development Agency? Because you were a senior researcher and earned a senior researcher salary for 5 years without a post-matric qualification. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. No, I think I would not do that. Maybe I must give maybe the question should have been, what is the circumstance that led to that? Because I did not apply for a post of senior researcher. Because the problem, I had to put the CV accurately to the fact of the positions I occupied, because I didn't want to mislead anybody. Now, what would have happened in the instance, I never applied to be a senior researcher chair. I applied to be a PA and working in the office of the chief whip in the municipality there. Now, because I was deployed in a political office, there was movement. They just placed me as a senior researcher. I could not say no.
Lukanamgoni, you've already alluded to the competency test, but does that make sense then for you when you have people who may or may not necessarily possess the skills that in the end you're going to end up with projects in this organization that simply don't go anywhere, and if anything, people are given money to simply go away from NYDA offices? Your thoughts on this particular candidate that was just interviewed, but importantly, the non-visibility of NYDA project?
Well, Toli, I mean, I think this is an interesting one. Again, it goes back to what I was calling a sifting and how the shortlisting gets done, because effectively you've got a candidate who would have said in their CV in terms of skills and work experience, they've been a senior researcher. And if the person sifting through 500 CVs sees that and says, okay, maybe this one has a fair chance, let them go, but then might not have really looked closely in terms of qualifications and when they were attained and so on. So I think that's part of the issue I'm saying in terms of the selection criteria. But let's talk about this question about projects and the mandate of the NYDA. Of course, the mandate of the NYDA is quite broad. The NYDA needs to set the National Youth Development Program. It has to set the national priorities for youth development, and it must do so through two instruments: the National Youth Plan, a development plan for youth, and the Integrated Youth Development Strategy. And then the NYDA also, interestingly, has another obligation, and that is to issue the Status of Youth report every 3 years. And in doing so, this institution actually has massive responsibility, and the Amendment Act, which came into effect last year, gives the NYDA, in terms of this Integrated Youth Development Strategy, a mandate to not only focus on the public sector, but also on the private sector, and around issues of civil society, so that you've got a whole of society approach that is mandated to the NYDA. So their mandate is vast. They should be setting standards. They should be setting goals and targets for various, whether it's companies, departments of government, and so on.
Yeah.
But I think the NYDA over the years has really gone through a process of just doing piecemeal projects that will not be visible in the current circumstances of the structural youth unemployment that we are facing. And they become a spray and pray kind of projects where you are too scattered across the country and you are not achieving impact. Probably the only thing that has come at least closer to trying to achieve impact in terms of volume of number of young people who are participating in it is the National Youth Service. But beyond that, Koli, I think that there is a serious question about whether or not those who occupy the offices of the NYDA truly understand the vastness and the depth of, legislated powers that they actually enjoy in terms of driving the youth agenda. And before the Amendment Act, in actual fact, the NYDA reported directly to the president, which gave it something of some quasi-ministerial kind of status that, it didn't have to go through a minister, which of course now the Amendment Act says they must report to the Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. But I think which was probably a wrong thing to do, which diminishes the NYDA and subordinates it to a ministry rather than directly interacting with the president. So clearly I'm trying to say, yes, indeed, I would understand when people say the NYDA is invisible because of the vastness of issues faced by young people, not only just in terms of unemployment, but other social ills that need intervention. For example, if you talk about the question of drug and substance abuse, you've got to ask, where has the NYDA been in terms of championing rehabilitation centers and forcing, whether it's district municipalities, to ensure that there are rehabilitation centers that are closer to young people, that are closer to communities, and people don't have to travel very far. So I think they've thought in a programmatic way rather than in a structural and systemic intervention way.
Lukhona Mnguni, thank you very much for your insights here. He is a political analyst giving us his thoughts on the NYDA selection process.